Resch. I quoted Lang. Well, I didn't quote him, I paraphrased. Some scholarly Resch would be doing this and would probably get it wrong. But Stevenson was driven to complete the book that he had started six years earlier. Kidnap of David Balfour is the sequel to Kidnap. And I asked Barrett when she was putting it up to put side by side Kidnap and David Balfour, because in a sense they form one book. They are separate novels, of course. They were published separately, but it's one story. David Balfour had the unfortunate experience of getting lost over time, falling into the shadow of Kidnap. And so unless you were hardcore Stevensonian, people didn't even know that there was a second volume. So as I said in the beginning of my preface, I said, never follow a great story with a sequel. But of course nobody pays attention to that. I would like to just read briefly. You know, when you're a professor of literature, you're in the English department. The English department is always divided in two. There's the people who teach literature, and there's the people who are creative writers. And when a creative writer publishes a book, which is usually a novel or a set of poems or short stories, then they go out and they have a little event. They're introduced, they get up and say, let me read. And they open the book and they start reading. When a professor publishes the book and he goes out and maybe has an event, nobody says to them, read. They don't really want to hear it, you see, because they know what it's going to sound like. So they give a talk and they have to prepare a presentation. But you have no choice. I have decided there's that time of year or that age when even the professor can say, well, I'm going to read this. But what I want to read from is early in my preface. Kidnap was dedicated to Stevenson's great friend, Charles Baxter. I mean, what a wonderful dedication. And it's in that dedication that Stevenson introduces the subject of Kidnap, the trial of James Stewart, which had been the occasion and the source for the novel. And he tells him, you know, the trial is all wrong and these things are all wrong, but don't worry about it. You know, no, this is not a book for a scholar's library. This is just something to while the boy away at night to sleep. You know. So there's the whole idea of the boy's book, you know, is sort of introduced or inserted by Stevenson himself in his dedication. Fast forward, now he's in Samoa. And as some of you may know, that was a great enterprise, Samoa. I call it agrarian enterprise. He had his family there. He had servants or Samoans who were involved in the agriculture. I mean, it was a great big to-do. So now he finishes Balfour and he writes the dedication again to Baxter. I'm not going to read the dedication. I'm going to read my take, or my riff on the dedication. While the book, Balfour, is one part of a great epic, it tells its own story in its own manner, at times reminiscent of Kidnap, but in the main more reflective and philosophical, as befits its subject and its author's added years. The difference can also be seen in the new dedication to Charles Baxter. Unlike the playfulness of the earlier inscription in Kidnapped, this one looks to the past and is touched by the poignancy of remembrance. Stevenson conjures up the places of his youth and names them, for the naming becomes an invocation of old wanderings and dreams that are now no more than memories. But almost immediately, that reverie of recollection turns into a visionary thought. Stevenson sees his own past as a seedling in the generation of new lives. For some young man today walking the streets of Edinburgh will be dreaming fresh and drawing anew from all those who trod before. The spirit of the places and the people insinuating itself into his newfound experience. Stevenson sees his past as one in a great stream of pasts, and he links his own life with no hint of its storied grandeur in the endless chain of all lives, or at least those in the far north of his own country. It is as if he were looking down from a distant corner of space and time, marveling at the continuous cycle of life, and wondering how it all can be so glorious and so inconsequential at the same time. At once bewildered and entranced, Stevenson is talking of himself and the ineluctable circumstances that led him to write these lines on a small island in a vast ocean, as if it were foretold that he would end up finishing his old story of distant brays and clan quarrels in a newer world of coral seas and strange tongues that became his final home. For just as sequels are fated to disappoint those who have waited long for them, in like manner do we discover our destinies well after we have become inured to them, and all we can do is admit the inevitableness of our lives. Now that's, that's my take on Stevenson's, the change in the preface. I mean, this is a man who is now looking back, and he's true, he's only 44 years old, 43 years old, but he's looking back on life as if he were a much older man, or perhaps with the kind of wisdom that we associate with him. You know, Stevenson said he was not born to live to be old, and of course, he never did. But there is an elegiac note, of course, in that dedication that he writes to Baxter, and it's also something of an elegiac note in the novel as a whole, in David Balfour. Now, I think I'll just I'll indicate some of the issues or the themes in Balfour that are very prominent. And one thing, we all associate Stevenson with this idea of duality. Jekyll and Hyde, of course, is the classic example, theme for which he, became famous. But in Balfour, that duality gives over to what I call contrariety or ambiguity. For example, it's a book about lawyers. And these are studies in contraries. For one hand, you have lawyers who are just absolutely skilled in black letter law. They are presumably skilled at logic, at argument, and yet the lawyers in David Balfour are filled with ambition. They're prepared to suborn witnesses. It is a world not of justice, but a world of greed, a world of, I don't want to say chicanery, doesn't capture it, but it is something completely different to the idea of absolute justice. And David Balfour in this book is really discovering the world. Now in Kidnapped, he discovered the world in the country, in the Highlands. But in David Balfour, he is suddenly introduced to the city. It's the discovery. Edinburgh is the site, and this is David's introduction to a new world. In a way, this is what we call, the 19th century called this a Bildungsroman, a novel in which character was formed. You see this in David Copperfield and Dickens. You see this in Stendhal, the Rouge and the Red and the Black. You see it in Henry James's Portrait of a Lady. It was a standard form. Young man, usually from the provinces, suddenly comes into the world, undergoes experiences, and at the end he's changed. He discovers a great deal about life. Well, in this case, of course, the formation of character and the chronicle of adventures are those of David Balfour. And David Balfour, of course, is such a well-known figure that it seems almost redundant to try to isolate or identify some of the most important characteristics that make him the figure he is. He's smart, he's rational, he's witty, he's educated. Yet, despite all these qualities, he's rough around the edges when he comes into the world. He doesn't understand women. He doesn't have some of the skills that are required to survive, like he doesn't know how to fence. Alan Breck presumably taught him how to fence a few times, but it never took hold. So all of these things, which are going to cause him a lot of, anxiety and trouble, are, something that he has to be contended with. He is, of course, fundamentally courageous, and he is also fundamentally rational and full of what he calls common sense, you see. He meets Katrina, the heroine of the novel, in the first chapter, and immediately falls in love with her, and is one of the great passages in which Stevenson describes falling in love at first sight. Marvelous. One of the things I'm going to maybe not be logical, but be digressive. One of the things about this book that's different from most of his other books, not all, but most, is that he deals with the female in an adult manner. And he did this in The Beach of Falesa, but here he does it in the form of a love story. And I would say it's one of the most charming love stories in English fiction. As a matter of fact, not only do I say it, but Gary Wills said it, and I quote him on the back of the book, Jack. And if Gary Wills says it, how can it be wrong? He's a great public intellectual who's written about who knows what. But that's another aspect of literary history that's often interesting for people who are not always aware of it, doesn't know